Wilkinson, perhaps I could start with you. Could you tell the committee, did your greed bankrupt Wilko?
I don't believe so, no.
Do you want to just tell us why Wilko collapsed?
Would you like me to do that or Mark?
I would like your perspective first, please.
Okay. So, in essence, Wilko failed because we ran out of cash. That is what is that's what caused the downfall in the end. There were a lot of contributory factors that led to that over quite a long period of time, and clearly we had a strategy to deal with those factors that were hitting us, but Wilko went out of business before that strategy was fully implemented. There were a series of external factors and there were a series of internal factors, and I'm mindful that you'll want me to keep my answers short, so I need to try and do that. Externally, we're all familiar with the landscape. We had declining high streets, and Wilko is very much a high street based stores retailer, was very much a high street based stores retailer with long leases and high rents that kept us on those high streets. We, of course, faced the cost of business rates. We faced COVID like all businesses did, and during COVID we stayed open. We didn't furlough any team members, and I like to think that we were supportive of team members who had high risk because of medical conditions they had. We also, I think, relatively unusually paid our landlords in full throughout COVID. So the things we took advantage of were the delays in paying VAT, which we paid off, and the business rates concessions, but other than that we stayed open during COVID and covered our costs. And I think there's some debate that Mark will bring into the picture about whether we should or shouldn't have done that, but we did. We were about to enter in, we aren't a business with a history of debt, so if you look at our accounts, which are publicly available at Companies House, we don't have a history of carrying debt. And then during 2022, we were trying to move from a revolving credit facility, which we didn't use, but to a more secured debt position. We were about to enter into secured lending arrangements with Macquarie when the 2022 mini budget happened. Literally, we were in the midst of that. And at that point, the interest terms on that loan were hiked massively, and that became infeasible, and so that was a contributor externally. Financially, our revenues were falling faster than our cost base could be reduced, which was eroding cash, as you can see in the figures for 2022. We lost the confidence, sadly, of key allies. So we lost the confidence of Lloyds Bank, which had been our bank for 90 years, and they pulled away from us in 2022. We lost the confidence of the credit assurers, who pulled away from us in autumn 2022. We got some amazing support from some of our goods for resale and goods not for resale suppliers, but we didn't get support from enough of them to sustain us through that. We couldn't manage to obtain the further inward investment we needed, either by way of debt or equity, to continue to trade and implement our strategy. Our customers, and you can see this in the figures over time, have gradually reduced shopping with Wilko. Lots of people have their theories as to why. Some on my list, if you're interested, are that we failed to grow and scale our online business. The cost of living crisis clearly reduced our sales. We had big internal challenges around product availability that was caused by many internal difficulties to do with things like lorry driver shortage, distribution centres, infrastructure changes, lack of credit assurance and low supplier confidence. We had moved to a position where we had an unclear customer proposition, and I've heard some of the statements people have made as against the discounters. We're a value retailer, but our proposition was unclear against the discounters. We failed to satisfactorily address our category and product offer and move to something different and better. We had huge pressure on margin rate, spiralling costs, and I think it's been alluded to that Wilko was over-rented on the high street, and we had weak processes and infrastructure. I'm sure there are more, sir, but those are the ones in my mind.
That's a long list
It's
of
a long list.
failures, and the failure of that strategy has now left the taxpayer on the hook for over £40 million worth of financial support for those made redundant. We have a pension fund deficit of over £50 million, and we have creditors who are at best going to see 4p in the pound on the debts that Wilko owes to them. Do you want to just take this moment to apologise to those workers who are facing Christmas without work?
So I am thankful to so many people for so many things that they have done to help Wilko, not least amongst those the fantastic team members that have always worked at Wilko, the amazing suppliers and advisors who have supported us, and of course, top of that list has got to be the fantastic customers who shopped with us for over 90 years in our stores. I am devastated that we have let each and every one of those people down with the insolvency that Wilko has done. I don't know how to put into words how sad I am that we have let down all our customers, all our team members, our suppliers, our advisors. Genuinely, I don't know what you want me to say, but I have always gone on record.
Sorry was the one word I was looking for, which
you
I
can
didn't
have
hear.
the word sorry. Of course, I'm sorry if you wish me to say the word sorry.
I wanted just to give you that opportunity.
No, I thought devastated covered it. I apologise. I wasn't trying to be clever. I am sorry that we are not there supporting all those people anymore.
It was a long list of problems that you identified, from the Prime Minister's budget through to the partners that you had, for example, your financial partners. What were the mistakes that you made?
What would I do differently if I had the time again is a question I ask myself all the time. I would do differently that year that was 2022. We started out that year not as strong as we should have done, but strong. We had positive cash, we had positive EBITDA, we had decent trading sales, we had no debt position at all at the beginning of 2022. And in each 4-week period of 2022, by trading down on our numbers, we were eroding cash. So the first thing I would like to do differently, if I could, was be more proactive on that declining sales that was dropping into cash through 2022. The next two things are a popularity vote, I'm afraid. I wish I had brought Mark in earlier. I think he could have made a difference if we had brought him in earlier. And I wish I had taken the advice of PricewaterhouseCoopers earlier. Those are the three things that I wish I had done earlier.
Mr McDonald.
Thank you, Chair. Well, indeed, the problems didn't start in 2022, of course. PwC had already identified issues. Just something that came out in the previous session, I just want to clear up, if I could. The last set of accounts for the year 29th of January 2022 was signed off by EY in November of 2022. Now, if the business wasn't sustainable at that point, what was the conversation going on in that interim period opposite the sale of a major asset to try to improve the situation? Was there a conversation about trying to make the picture look a little bit better with the sale of a major asset?
So, I am going to answer the question, but before I answer the question, I need to say I am not a financially qualified person. I don't come from a financial background, and to get that question answered, as I suspect you would like it answered, I would need either my CFO or a member of my finance team to do it, or the chair of my audit committee who is also financially qualified. That doesn't mean I'm not going to answer it. I am going to answer it.
Can I just check, Ms Wilkinson, that you are a family director of the company?
I'm a family director of the company.
With the fiduciary duties that go with that?
I have the fiduciary, and of course that's why I'm going to answer the question, but I can't answer it from that financially qualified perspective. So my understanding as a director was that two things had to be true for us to sign off our accounts for that year end. One, we had to have sufficient cash and liquidity to ensure that we could continue to trade as a going concern, and the second one was that we had to have reasonable and achievable, sensible financial trading numbers that we were predicting we were going to deliver through 2023, we were put under enormous pressure by our then auditors, EY, to prove both of those things, that we would have adequate cash and that our numbers were reasonable and achievable. The adequate cash, as you've seen, because it's on record, was coming from either secured lending against our distribution centre in Worksop, or as it transpired, a sale and leaseback of Worksop. And secondly, through an ABL, assets-based lending, which we secured ultimately through Wilko, which was secured against many things, but principally against, from memory, stock and intellectual property, but there were other things too within that. So on the one dynamic, we needed to prove to our auditors that we had sufficient cash. The second side of it was that we had to prove that we had reasonable and achievable trading numbers that we were likely to hit as we went through the financial year, which is 23. We ran more sensitised versions of those numbers than even I can remember, to do a worst case scenario and then an even worse case scenario and then an even worse case scenario.
Okay, well, can I just interrupt there, because we're up against time to some degree. But according to the Sunday Times, Wilko was advised in 2022 by restructuring advisors from Teneo to use a company voluntary arrangement to close some stores and renegotiate rents on others. How did you respond to that advice?
So my understanding, because I was not directly involved with Teneo,
But as a director?
As a director, it was reported to me at Holding Board, absolutely right. So my understanding is that in early 2022, verbal discussions took place with Teneo about whether a creditors voluntary arrangement, a CVA, was an appropriate route for Wilko. And at that time, I understand that my CEO and my property director were told that it was not, because our financial position was not sufficiently bad to do a CVA. By September, I believe it was, of 2022, we had a long report into the Holding Board, and within that long report, as part of the contingency planning, if trading continued to deteriorate, a CVA was discussed. It was not proposed as a do-it-right-now scenario. It was proposed that if trading continued, it was a contingency plan.
Can I ask you about that? But you say it wasn't a do-it-right-now, but wasn't it the advice from Teneo to do it right now?
No, it was not. In November, they repeated the advice around a CVA, again as a contingency for if trading continued to decline. And the consensus was we did a step plan. Step number one was to do the secured lending or the sale and leaseback. Step number two was to do the ABL. Step number three, to be planned in the first quarter of 2023, was to consider doing a CVA, with the suggestion that we would have an implementation date of April 2023, because that would release the most cash onto the balance sheet. My understanding is you get a better business rates position if we had done it at the beginning of April. I do not know the detail of it, but that is my understanding, which is what we did. So during the first quarter of 2023, we did the planning for a CVA. We did it at that point with PricewaterhouseCoopers, not with Teneo. And there was a subtle difference. In the original report, Teneo had believed that the CVA would be largely a pension scheme voted CVA, because it had the pension deficit as a very high figure in its report. As it transpired, that was not accurate. And we were doing predominantly a landlord-voted CVA. That meant we had to do a much tighter cost reduction programme in order to try to secure the votes of the landlords in favour of that CVA. And that took us over the April date in doing that cost-cutting exercise before we could put the CVA position before the landlords. But the nub of it is, did we listen to the advice and did we follow it? Yes, we listened to the advice. Yes, we followed it.
Okay, well, that's not everybody's interpretation of those events. And I'll perhaps put to you, Ms Wilkinson, and Mr Jackson. The Sunday Times quoted a restructuring source as saying Wilko failed due to naivety, incompetence, a failure to listen to people who've done these things for a long time, and just stubbornness, resulting in a complete car crash and the loss of a third-generation business which could have been saved. Mr Jackson, how accurate is that?
If that's referring specifically to the CVA, then it's inaccurate. I think...
No, it's referring to the failure of the business.
I mean, I can't comment on... I was appointed at Christmas 22, and I have to say that most of my time was spent looking forward on what needed to be done and at what pace.
You had to look back to understand what had gone wrong, so how accurate is that characterisation?
You've heard different conjecture this morning, and I would call it conjecture. The reality is, at the end of January 21, the balance sheet of the business was pretty well placed. Well placed, okay, despite views on discounting versus value retail in the right or wrong place on the high street. All of those are issues, and they all impacted the business. But there was over 100 million of cash, over 100 million of P&L reserves. They're, in my view, the biggest contributory factors to the cash outflow were, of course, the increased competition, but global supply chain issues, cost increases, failing to act on cost reduction, but most importantly, I believe that with hindsight, I would not have furloughed, I would not have stayed open. I would have taken advantage, protected the business on the furlough scheme and rents, like 90% of other retailers. There was a warehouse management system implementation that was nothing short of a disaster that led to a shortage of availability in store stock. Therefore,
Project Optimus, is it?
Yes. Project Optimus is a wider project that included spending £60 million on bringing warehouses up to scratch. So you can quickly see COVID impact of not furloughing, yes, stayed open and traded, but cash was going out the door. The DC sale and leaseback became necessary, as did the ABL. The ABL gave us a window. When I came in, a sufficient window. It required a lot of things to be done quickly. But we took 90 million of costs out on an annualised basis. We planned very detailed a CVA with CBRE, who are the same people that Teneo would have used. There wasn't a change in strategy around the CVA. That fundamentally underpinned. So the 90 million of cost out of the structure, then 35 to 40 through a CVA, but most importantly, we had to get suppliers back on board. A large number of them had restricted credit or were on stop. If you read the press, then most of this was driven, most of the sales shortfall in the last 2 years was driven by poor availability. It's poor availability because they didn't have the cash to pay the suppliers. So going through the ABL, taking all of the suppliers through the cost reduction programme, showing the window, showing that there was a planned CVA, it still required funding post-CVA. Actually, that turnaround plan could have been delivered. Actually, the biggest single factor in it not being delivered was news of the CVA leaking into the press, which made suppliers who had got back on board very nervous again, and availability started to fall, and then it became a vicious circle.
Ms Wilkinson, do you recognise that characterisation? And in addition, some informed observers felt that with a cost of living crisis and shoppers looking for bargains, this should have been Wilko's time to shine, as it's been described. Do you recognise that and the characterisation of others?
I recognise Mark's characterisation. I'm sorry, I forgot what your characterisation was in the first place.
Well, it was simply that the naivety and incompetence and failure to listen to people who had done these things for a long time, and stubbornness resulting in a complete car crash and the loss of a third generation business which could have been saved. That's the charge that's put to you.
Well, I don't recognise not listening, no. I do recognise the devastation in losing a third generation business. It is devastating. I don't know what you want me to say. You know, I do believe Wilko could have been saved, but it was not.
Mr. Gullis.
Thank you very much, Chair. Ms Wilkinson, I'm just a bit baffled because you've talked about 2022 a lot, and of course I totally accept that there were economic impacts external to the business that have impacted. But we heard from, I'm pretty sure it's Professor Shah, if not I apologise for the other panellists, pointed out in the first panel that in the audit accounts of 2018-19, in the last sentence of the going concern section, the financial viability of the business was in question. So why was that not acted upon, and why is it all the blame is being put on 2022? I feel a sleight of hand here. It's easy to point fingers at the government, it's easy to talk about COVID, it's easy to talk about cost of living. The reality is you had the warning signs in the last sentence. Was it simply the case that you and the directors didn't read the audit report?
So I don't know how to answer that question. We did read the audit report. We are taken through the audit report by our auditors in holding board meetings. Whichever auditors we have, we go through that and we always scrutinise it. It is true that the trading position of Wilko's in terms of turnover was weakening over the years. I think we always scrutinised and took steps to address everything we could. We had relatively, not as strong trading performance, but we had relatively strong trading performance until we hit financial year 2022. So we're still in 2021, we're still taking 1.36 billion turnover. We've got EBITDA of 48.3 million. We've got net assets of 118.4 million. We're still in a relatively good position by the end of 2021. It is during 2022 that position declines.
The truth is, though, the warning signs were written in 2018 and action wasn't taken until 2022. So there's a 4-year period of inaction in essence, in my opinion. And Mr MacDonald earlier, who's no longer in his place, was just raising about the fact that you've been sort of warned about maybe looking at some of the high street shops and renegotiating the leases. And you said that the advice wasn't sort of told to do it now, it was just given to you. Well, when my partner tells me to put the rubbish out and I ignore it the first time, and then she tells me to put it out a second time, that means do it now. So I'm a bit confused when the business has repeated its advice twice, that's not been taken as a bit of a hint, at the very least, that you need to do something.
I'm sorry if I gave you the impression we weren't doing anything about the fact that we were over-rented and that our stores were in the wrong place. Of course we were. That was a active stream of work for as long as I can remember in reducing our lease obligations, and I would have to bring the relevant head in to enable you to have the detail. I just don't have the detail on that today. So I'm sorry, I thought you were referring to the more aggressive approach through the CVA mechanic. But yes, we had been working for many years to reduce our rent bill and to reduce the length of our leases and to get our stores into the right places. It was an ongoing job of work.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Jackson, was it your view that the Teneo advice was inaccurate?
I think we have to separate out. Was a CVA inaccurate? No. A CVA would have put the business in a much better position, but a CVA is an insolvency process. It's an insolvency process that requires funding on the other side, otherwise you won't get through it. Their analysis was incorrect. Their analysis, 75% of people who vote by value have to vote in favour for it to go through. Their analysis of voting had a pension scheme that could put it through on its own. and no other creditors mattered. The reality is that wasn't true, and that all landlords needed to be taken through, all suppliers did. So the planning detail behind a successful CVA was not the same as what Teneo had proposed.
Does that mean that, in your judgment, it couldn't be implemented?
No, it could have been implemented.
It could have been implemented.
But it couldn't have been implemented until you've got funding and you are insolvent. So it couldn't have been implemented when they recommended, which was back end of 22. It couldn't have been done at the time. Mm-hmm. It was a deferred recommendation. It wasn't to do it now. Absolutely not. It couldn't. That's just impossible. You have to be insolvent to do a CVA. The business was not insolvent. It had a declining cash base. It had freehold property of £80 million in value. It wouldn't have been possible until all of those plans had been worked through.
Was there a way, therefore, to pursue that reform?
I believe so. Again, all of this is with hindsight. Mm-hmm. We had a window if we could have got suppliers on board. We then went to, with the detailed CVA plans, we went to at least 20 potential investors, both private equity and debt, and actually looking at full sale of the business. You had to get funding secured throughout the CVA process, because suppliers will say, oh, hang on, am I going to get paid only when I know that we got through this? And then you need funding the other side. That funding required a detailed plan, and we had funding agreed the other side, but the funding up front still required, we had an ABL agreed with Wilko. Wilko didn't want to be in the long term, so we had to get the two parties to work together. As time ran on, the lack of availability of stock in store made the position worse each day. But there was definitely a window where the turnaround could have been done. And actually the difference in funding that we could raise and the funding that was required is quite a bit less than the cost to the taxpayer.
Why was that opportunity not seized if there was a window of opportunity?
Because we couldn't get the funders to back it.
So it was an external constraint rather than a decision of the business?
Yes, absolutely. It was pursued. I knocked down an awful lot of doors more than once, and we had interested parties right up to the beginning of August who were really keen to save the business, and I thought still a very good chance of doing so.
And what was stopping these creditors?
Ultimately, the amount of security in the balance sheet was falling every day. So the amount that people who were secured lenders were prepared to lend was also reducing. The climate that we are in, the UK economic climate, particularly for retail, with future cost increases, the investment community were not overly keen. So I could get about 15 million unsecured, and I could get 40 to 45 of secured lending, bringing a total of around 60, 65 maybe. 75 to 90 was the need.
You see our problem. Our problem is that in 2021, you've got 108 million in cash on the balance sheet. We've got a deterioration in trading conditions, but that affects every business on the high street. Other players seem to have been able to weather this storm, and you did not. So we're trying to understand why you didn't when others did, when you started with such a strong cash position.
I wasn't in the midst of the decision making, but if you can imagine paying rents, which I think are £90 million a year, not furloughing people, and spending 60 million on 2 warehouses, the impact of credit insurance being pulled, accelerating cash out to suppliers, that can happen quite quickly.
But those are all examples of management failure.
I wasn't there at the time, so I can't comment on the decisions
Ms
and the
Wilkinson,
reasons why they were made.
You were there at the
I
time,
was
so
there.
why were those decisions taken?
Why was it, so there are many decisions that Mark talked about. Which ones do you want me to
Well, let's
focus
go
on?
through all of them. So let's go through the furlough, let's go through the failure of Project Optimus. Let's start with those two.
So we took a decision to stay open. The history of Wilko is that it has always stayed open. It stayed open throughout World War II. It's always stayed open when challenges happen. We were an essential retailer. We debated at great length as a board whether we should stay open, and the decision we took was to stay open, to not furlough our team members, to support those who were medically vulnerable, and to pay our landlords in full. That is the decision we took.
And the warehouse project?
We have had two warehouses, DC1 and DC2. One is in Magor in Wales, one is in Worksop. The warehouse project was taken, there were two forms to the warehouse project. There was warehouse management system implementation across both distribution centres, and there was a relay of the racking and the layout of both distribution centres. That was taken many years ago, the decision to implement, and then was a phased programme that started with Magor, which was the smaller of the two distribution centres. So it was an implementation of warehouse management system and of relay of racking, and then that moved on to distribution centre 1. Clearly, it was done with the intention to improve at the processes in our warehouse. We had out-of-date machinery, it was very manual. We weren't as efficient as we could be, and a decision was taken by the board collectively as a capital investment to do that work.
So, Ms Venning, what advice did you give to the business about the Teneo advice?
Well, firstly, thank you to the committee for inviting us here today
You're welcome.
to talk about our role as auditors of Wilko, and indeed on audit reform as well. We have listened quite carefully to the last panel and do welcome the opportunity to offer some corrections and to answer your questions. Turning to your specific question, Chair, it's not our role as auditors to offer advice to the company. The company will make management decisions. They are involved in the day-to-day running of the business. Our role as auditors is to assess the status of the business, the position of the business, and to come up with an independent view, an independent opinion as to whether the accounts as presented by management and signed off by the directors are indeed true and fair, and provide the users with an appropriate view in terms of the position that the company's in.
At no stage did you give advice about whether to pursue the kinds of ideas that were in the Teneo proposal?
It wasn't appropriate for us to do that in the role. As auditors, we wouldn't give advice on that. It's very important that we are independent.
Is that a no? Did you give advice on whether to pursue the Teneo proposal, yes or no?
It wasn't our role to do so.
Is that a no?
It's a no.
Okay, thank you. What advice did you give the business about the steps that it might need to take in order to remain a going concern, for example, around the sale of the warehouse?
So again, it's not our position as auditors to offer advice to the business. It would be highly inappropriate for us to do so. We are an independent body that assesses the decisions that management make in terms of how they feed themselves through into the accounts to be sure that they are true and fair. In terms of the assessment that we went through from a going concern perspective, I think it's very important actually for the committee to understand, and hopefully it's helpful for us to jump to what our opinion actually said in terms of our view, in terms of the position of the business. So if you wouldn't mind just for 2 minutes for me just to read out the very specific piece in our opinion. Yeah. I think it really is quite important actually, Chair, for the whole committee to understand the specific words that we said in our opinion, because I do think it frames the rest of the discussion that we'll have here today. So in our opinion, it says very clearly under the heading of material uncertainty related to going concern, it says at the date of approval of these financial statements, the group had insufficient committed financing in place to withstand a severe but plausible downturn in conditions, a severe but plausible downturn in trading activity through the going concern period to January 2024. These events and conditions indicate that a material uncertainty exists that may cast significant doubt on the group and company's ability to continue as a going concern. So, to the point that Mr Shah raised in the first panel, this was not hidden away. This was not loose language. This was very, very clear language in our audit opinion that brought serious attention to the situation that the business found itself in, and drew the attention of the users to the fact that there was a plausible scenario whereby the company could run out of cash if sufficient financing wasn't raised.
So did you, before you published that judgment, did you warn Wilko's management that there was a risk that they were not going to meet the going concern test?
Yeah, so as part of our audit, we do a lot of work in terms of challenging management around the forecasts that they prepare. It's important for the committee to understand that the preparation of the forecasts are management's responsibility. Our role as auditors is to challenge those, to challenge all the assumptions within them. So our audit for the January 2022 year end started in May of 2022, and we obtained those forecasts that management had prepared and set about assessing whether the assumptions within them were appropriate. We do that in a number of ways. So we do that by looking back at the historical accuracy of management's forecasting. We look at what industry predictions are saying around the business and around the sector, and we use our own understanding of the business and indeed involve our internal retail specialists to help us with that. And when we did all of that work, we concluded that the forecasts that management had prepared at the time were optimistic, and we challenged management to go away and revise those forecasts to take account of some of the challenges that we'd raised in relation to the assumptions. That process went on for a number of months. It was an iterative process where we continued to challenge management around the forecasting that they had presented to us. We ended up with 4 different versions of the forecasts and found ourselves in September with a sort of final position that had been put forward by management, which we still considered could be even more severe. So they went away diligently and prepared a final forecast for us, which in our view took account of the sort of severe but plausible downside that could be experienced in the business. And only at that point actually were we prepared to sign our opinion to conclude that the financial statements that the directors had prepared were true and fair.
And that last scenario entailed the sale of the warehouse?
The last scenario included the sale of the warehouse because that had happened in November before we signed off.
I think what we're struggling to understand is how you've got a set of accounts which are obviously bleeding cash pretty quickly at this stage. We've got some of the challenges around getting further agreements with creditors on board, and the accounts are basically being plugged with a one-off sale of a warehouse, and yet a going concern judgment is given.
So I come back to the fact that the going concern assessment, that is a basis of preparation of accounts that is dictated within the accounting standards. Our audit opinion drew a serious warning flag to the users of the accounts around the risks that were very plausible risks in the business. When we signed the accounts, there was £58 million worth of cash in the business. Part of that was from the sale and leaseback, but equally part of that was part of the receipts from the sale and leaseback went to repay the RCF. So, you know, we got to a place where we were comfortable that the audit opinion that we signed, and we still stand by today, was the right opinion because it drew the user's attention to the serious warning flag. Just to the comment that Mr. Shah made earlier.
Bust and you signed off the accounts and you stand by that judgment? That's an extraordinary conclusion.
We don't sign off the accounts. The directors sign off the accounts. We sign an audit
Signed
opinion.
it off as a going concern.
The directors sign the accounts as a going concern. We offer an opinion in relation to whether that set of accounts is true and fair. And in terms of the various other options that were available to us that Professor Shah mentioned earlier, the other options we had in terms of signing our opinion could have entailed firstly a clean opinion with no reference to any warning signs in the business at all, or it could have been a disclaimed opinion and we issue a disclaimed opinion if we don't have access to the books and records sufficient to be able to make our judgment. Or the third option would be an adverse opinion, which was the one that Professor Shah was alluding to. That opinion would have only been relevant in one of three situations. Firstly, the company had already taken the decision to put the business into liquidation. Secondly, the directors had already taken the decision to cease trade in the business. Or the third option would have been that the directors had no realistic alternative other than to do so. So that is the criteria that we were assessing at the date of our sign-off. And to have concluded with an adverse opinion at that point would have been a very extreme view. There were realistic alternatives for the business. You've heard today from management and also from the previous panel that this was not inevitable. There were options that the business was pursuing. There were financing options. There were a number of cost-cutting initiatives that were already in train, as well as growth opportunities. So for us to give that opinion would have been the wrong answer, so we stand by the opinion that we gave.
Okay, so Ms Wilkinson, what advice did you receive from EY about the decisions that you needed to take in order to keep the business as a going concern?
We didn't take advice from EY. EY were our auditors, not our advisors. We took advice from Teneo and from PricewaterhouseCoopers in 22-23.
Your point of view?
I mean, I again go back to Christmas 22. I joined. I am aware of the Teneo report, and I'm aware that PwC were appointed subsequent to Teneo, and yes, therefore, were providing advice.
And can I add, we did do as we were advised and pursue a CVA in the first quarter of 2023. The implementation date was pushed back further than April because we needed to do the cost cutting and to secure the support of the landlords. But that CVA advice was followed. It wasn't ignored. It was always intended that it was a contingency if trading continued to deteriorate, with planning in the first quarter of 23 and implementation from April. We did it later for the reasons I've given, but I don't know how else to put it, was not ignored.
I think you said earlier that you wish you'd done it earlier.
We couldn't have done the CVA earlier. What I'd like to have done earlier was scrutinise those trading figures earlier.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm just wondering, just going back to Svening's point about the discussions that you did have with Wilko at the time, what was the sort of tone of the discussions that you had? Because that's, I mean, you've laid out, you know, the number of steps that you've suggested, and we've had a response. But you know, was there a feeling of rejection of what you were putting forward, or was it, you know, how difficult were these discussions that you were having with the board of Wilko or the financial director at the time?
It's not unusual for directors to be optimistic about their business. Our role is to challenge those forecasts and to challenge the assumptions within it.
How was that challenge responded to?
Yeah, so as I said, it started in May. The directors were open to the challenge. They were receptive and responsive. They went away and revised the forecasts, as I said, a number of times in response to our challenges, and indeed as the trading activity panned out over the course of the year. This went on for a number of months. So they were entirely professional and responsive to our challenge.
Do you think that you know, you've said before just about the fact that you've in your reports that you've suggested that the company is a going concern. But looking back now, I mean, is there a point or a thought that goes through your head, and from your sort of director of audit as well, is there a thought that goes through your head that, you know, you should have been given a contrary opinion at that point based on the information that you have, how things have played out in the intervening period? Yeah,
look, you know, I have every sympathy for all the individuals at Wilko who have lost their jobs, and clearly when there's a corporate collapse, it is time for reflection. We have thought long and hard since the news of Wilko's collapse about whether we would have done anything differently. When we've done that, we've gone back to all of the steps that we did take, the challenge that we posed to management, the robustness with which we did our work, and the opinion that we got to was the right opinion, and we stand by that opinion.
Right. And is there a review process within your company to allow you to do that within the audit team and reflect on the, your audit fee and so on, how much you've...
Yeah, may I add to that? Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the critical things is that we've introduced as a lesson learned from previous corporate failings is the need for broader consultation internally to make sure that the partner signing the opinion feels both supported and challenged in the decisions that they're making. And one of the critical things in this situation is to make sure that the distinction between whether to sign an opinion with a material uncertainty, as we did, or to sign an adverse opinion, which would undoubtedly have resulted in the earlier wind-up of the company, that public interest is taken into account in that decision-making.
And was that part of the discussions that you had with Wilko at the time to say there will be an adverse opinion that we might have to give here unless you take the action that's, that is required to actually make the company long-term solvent and sustainable?
The discussion that was had at the time was around the understanding of these realistic alternatives that the business had. So, as soon as we were comfortable that there were realistic alternatives other than for the company to collapse, and they included the ongoing discussions that they were in with lenders, the ongoing cost-cutting exercises that they were involved in, and the growth opportunities that they were exploring, as soon as we knew that they were realistic opportunities and alternatives to collapse, then it was very clear to us that an adverse opinion would have been the wrong answer.
And the final question would be, just when you took over the audit responsibilities from PwC, was anything at that point red flagged from the previous auditor to suggest that this is a company that you needed to take especially careful consideration of, given the previous history and the fact that the whole market and the declining sort of footfall for the company was on the down? Was it something that you were concerned about as an auditor, that you thought, well, we need to put in almost like a good team here or a special measures team to make sure that the company is protected, or that you can give the best advice possible?
There were no red flags raised to us by PwC when we took on the audit. We go through a very careful process of client acceptance, as you would expect, and we assess the financial health of the business as well as the directors that are involved at the time. And when we went through that, we didn't have any concern around taking on Wilko as an audit client.
Lavery.
Thanks. Ms Wilkinson, you mentioned before that, under your guidance, the company Wilko was a really friendly company. The workforce felt part of the family, and everybody respected each other. I wonder if the workforce actually think that now, as a result of what has happened, because at the same time as everybody was part of this huge welcoming, embracing family, the Wilkinson family creamed off nearly £150 million in dividends over a period of 20 years, and that includes £3.75 million in the year preceding the collapse of Wilko. Now, the question would be, of course, is if that amount of profit has been made, the family's creamed it off, and then you look at the 12,000 people who lost their jobs through the closure of 400 plus stores, the had their livelihood taken away from them. And not only that, the potential for financial security in terms of a pension scheme is in jeopardy as well. Why on earth did this family-friendly company with 12,000 dedicated workers, why did they decide not to invest more in the company? And indeed, why did they not put any finances, any of the profits which you creamed off for your family, into the pension scheme, which I think is being suggested this morning? The estimated pension scheme now is a deficit of £76 million on a buyout basis.
There's a lot in there. Yes, the team members in Wilko did feel like one big family, and I am sure that as between themselves...
You think they feel like that now?
As between themselves, I'm sure they still do. I'm sure I am no longer included in that family, but I am sure that as between themselves, they still do, and I'm very proud of them for feeling that way. They're an amazing group of people. I've not worked in many businesses, but I've always been proud to be part of the team members in Wilko, and will continue to thank them for everything they did in trying to save it. Should we do pension deficit? So the pension deficit that is visible to the directors is the deficit that is on a going concern basis. This was our understanding of the numbers. So when in the last couple of years, so in financial year ending 2022, we understood the deficit to be minus 12.2 million, and in financial year 2023, we understood the deficit to be 7.4 million, respectively, those dates. In both of those years, we made pension contributions in financial year 2022 of 8.4 million, and in financial year 23, again, 8.4 million. So the directors' belief at the time was that the scheme, the group retirement benefit scheme was being funded with a view to it in a short period of time not having a deficit at all. In addition to that, towards the tail end of 2022, we agreed that there would be a security for the group retirement benefit scheme over our second distribution centre in Magor. I believe that equated to about £20 million. So if you were sitting in the boardroom of Wilko at that point, you would have believed that the deficit was 12.2 and then 7.4, so going down, and that you were paying in two lots of 8.4 plus a security of 20 million. I'm not suggesting that we were being smug about it. We were still focusing on the pension, but were we focusing on the pension and doing our best to ensure that that pension was covered? We were. I don't understand myself, I apologise for not being finance, where the new pension deficit number comes from, but I believe it is valued on a different basis because we are no longer in business. So it's valued on a discontinuance basis, which gives us a higher deficit. But the figure that you talk about is not the figure that I would have recognised when I was sitting in the boardroom and when we collectively were making decisions around pension contributions and pension deficit. Now, I can give you the pension deficit and the contributions for the 9-year period if you would like them, but I'm trying to keep it.
I think the point Mr. Lavery is really underlining is that you were taking dividends out of a business that was failing, that had a pension deficit.
Okay.
How can that be justified?
So the easiest way I can explain the dividend is, yes, there was a return made to shareholders by way of dividend. My understanding is that is...
When you say shareholders, you mean you?
So I did not receive any dividends in my personal capacity.
Mm-hmm.
There were no dividends paid to individual people. I was not a shareholder in my personal capacity.
The dividends presumably went to the holding company.
The dividends went to Amalgamated Holdings Wilkinson Limited, which was put in place in, I believe, 2017.
You're a shareholder in that?
No, there are a series of family trusts who are a shareholder in that. So I genuinely am not fibbing when I say I did not hold a share in a personal capacity. Amalgamated Holdings Wilkinson Limited was put in place, contrary to what one of the earlier panels said, to give everybody visibility, because sometimes trusts in this country are viewed as being opaque. We put that vehicle in, actually not as a defence mechanic for the family, but as a means of people being able to see what went out of the Wilko Group into the family holding company, and then, if anything had been paid out of the family holding company, what came out? Nothing came out. We didn't pay anything out in those years.
Mr. Lavery.
I can cover the dividends if you would like me to.
I think we've got the information we need, thanks. The question I would just conclude on, Ms Wilkinson, is that we've heard evidence this morning from the J&B union, which states quite clearly that you haven't once offered an apology, you haven't communicated with the staff, you haven't acknowledged that the company and how the company have ended up in the position where it is. And at the question of the chair this morning, you said you offer an apology. I mean, will you be offering an apology? Are you sincere in an apology to the 12,000 people who you've said twice this morning are like being basically the bedrock of your company? Why have you not apologised until this morning?
I'm not sure I'm allowed to say this, but before
You're under parliamentary privilege, you can say what you like.
Before Wilko went into administration, or actually it might have been shortly after, I might have got my timing right, I asked to do an announcement to all team members to thank them and to say all of the things that you have said. But the advice from the directors and from the administrators was that I should not do that. Subsequently, of course, I've responded to anybody who messaged me, and I'm not difficult to get hold of. And in addition, I'm a very private person who doesn't do interviews to the press, but I did an interview with Oliver Shah at the Times in order to say thank you to my team members. And he asked me what the one thing I wanted to get out was, and it was to thank my team members and my customers and my suppliers for everything they had done. And that is the only reason I did that interview. And yes, you can say it's not an appropriate newspaper for doing that in. I agree, it's not. It's not necessarily my team members and my customers' first newspaper of choice. But it was the only means I had of getting a thank you out to my team members. You today, thank you, have given me another opportunity to thank my team members and my customers. I will be thanking my team members and my customers to my dying day. You will never find me saying anything else. I appreciate each and every one of them, and I echo your words. They were the bedrock of Wilko.
Let me just wrap up this point with a question about the profitability between 2019 and 2022. The profits for that period of time was £11.6 million. The dividends that were paid out over that time was £7.5 million. That's two-thirds. Two-thirds of the profits of a company that was in trouble were paid out in dividends. How on earth can that be justified?
So I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I don't recognise that time period. I'm not disputing it at all, but I don't recognise the time period. In the 9 years since the demerger, we have taken out the shareholders have had about £15 million worth of dividend, which is about 1.7 million per year. Each of those dividends would have followed the correct corporate governance. They would have been recommended by the CFO as prudent. They would have gone through the boards of directors. We would only have paid those dividends if we had either the right profit in year or reserved profits, and I don't believe that they fell below 100 million, and we had cash to do that. We also, over that 9-year period, invested 273 million in the business and 36 million in the pension scheme. I hear you when you say we took 50 million.
Let me just go
out,
through it. 2019 profit 32.6. 2020 11.4, 2021 4.4, 2022 36.8. Dividends over that period 1.5, 1.5, 2.25, 2.25. That's 11.6 million pounds in profit and 7.5 million pounds in dividends. That is 65% of the profit between 2019 and 2022 was paid out in dividends from a business that was in trouble. And what is especially stark is that as the business plunged into deeper trouble, the dividends went up. How can that be justified?
My understanding is that the directors looked at the EBITDA figures and the reserves and cash, and that was the dividend that was recommended.
But it looks to us, just on the numbers, like you're burgling a failing business.
I can't answer the question in any other way. That is my understanding of how dividend is arrived at.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you. Wilkinson family is among the wealthiest families in the country, thanks to the Wilko business over 90 years. As things stand, there's a £50 million hole in the Wilko pension fund. Shouldn't the family be making good that hole so that at least the full pensions owed to people are paid?
I don't recognise that statement that we are one of the wealthiest families in the country, and I don't have assets to fill a £50 million hole in a pension scheme. I don't.
Can I ask, you explained to us that the dividends that were paid went into the holding company rather than to individuals, but
Yes.
but I mean, what happened to them? Is it still sitting in that holding company? What became of it?
Dividends from 2017 were paid into AHWL. They are sitting in AHWL. They are invested in start-up businesses, UK properties, and a limited amount of stock market investments.
So are there not resources there that can be used to fill the pension hole?
No, they are not. They are tied up in other things, and my understanding is, as a director of AHWL, I have legal obligations to act in the best interests of AHWL, having taken into account its stakeholders, and those do not include the group retirement benefits.
We heard
Certainly wouldn't add up to anything like that figure, because as we've pointed out, since 2017, there's not been anything like that money come out of the business in order to do that. You can see it at Companies House. The assets that Amalgamated Holdings Wilkinson Limited has are fully visible at Companies House. It's why we put the vehicle there in the first place, so people could see. Sorry.
We're told that the family has received nearly 150 million in dividends from Wilko, admittedly over 20 years. There surely must be some resources there that could be applied to the...
Do I have time, sir, to cover the dividends?
I'm sorry?
Do I have time to cover the dividends? Because I can't do a pithy one-liner on the dividend.
No, that's fine. We're quite interested in how so much money has come out,
so
leaving a great big deficit, which now somehow can't be filled because you've got fiduciary duties to the company that it was siphoned into.
So, since April 2014, and there's a reason I'm taking these dates, I'm not trying to be tricky, but since 2014, which is since the remaining shareholders, the shareholders that retain the business have been in the business, the total dividends have been 15.6 million, which is an average, I hear, sir, the figures, but an average of 1.7 per annum. The P&L reserves and assets were well over 100 million. We didn't carry any debt. The cash at the year end has averaged 77 million over that period, with a low of 58 and a high of 108. The pension contributions were 36.5 million, and investment decisions which are made prior to dividend decisions, as per the cash flow statements, we invested 273 million. So that is the period from 2014. The 2014 63 million dividend in specie was what is called a demerger, which in my terms is, instead of pushing businesses together, you're splitting them apart. And that secured the exit of shareholders who wished to leave the business. The easiest way to think about it is that consideration, that 63 million was consideration for their shares. So those shareholders who wished to exited the business, taking the 63 million. The remaining shareholders, the ones that stayed behind, received no dividend that year. So that is where the 63 million comes in. My understanding prior to 2014, and we're going back a period of time now, but my understanding prior to 2014 is that the dividends were higher, reflecting a more profitable business and a higher number of shareholders. Much of the funds in that period were used by the shareholders who were to remain in 2014 to do the initial buyout stages for the shareholders who were ultimately to leave on the demerger in 2014. That is how the figures break down.
Notwithstanding that buyout, that would still leave 100 million in dividends.
I'm sorry, sir.
That would still leave 100 million in dividends. So our understanding is that about 180 million has been removed. About 80 million of that was relating to the buyout that was recorded in the 2015 accounts. That would still leave about 100 million that has come out of the business between 2003 and 2022. That then leaves us with a pension fund that is still short, and 100 million dividends that has come out, and we're asking, why can't the dividends that have come out be used to fund the pension fund deficit?
I don't recognise those numbers. I'm happy to share that.
They're from your accounts.
I don't recognise them. I'm happy to share what they are. I'm happy to go back, dig through, and share what they are. I'm not trying to be difficult about it. The the dividends that the remaining shareholders had out prior to the 2014 demerger date largely went into the early stage transactions of buying out the shareholders who were exited in 2014. So the dividends that the remaining shareholders have are the dividends that have been paid since 2014, which over that period was, I think it was the 15.6 million. So so I can't answer the questions as to the others because we do not have it. The remaining shareholders do not have that money.
Where's it gone?
In buying out the shareholders who have left.
But there's 100 million in dividends that have gone into whatever the holding company is, over and above the 80 million that was gone to consolidate your control.
No, there is not. There is not. So the dividends that were paid before 2014,
Yeah.
the departure of the exiting shareholders took place in 3 transactions. It took place in a standard share buyback, a buyback and cancellation, and then a demerger. It was in 3 phases over a series of years. Those dividends that predate 2014, that were larger amounts, those shareholders who remained used that money to buy the shares in the phase 1 and phase 2 transactions. So they did not retain that money. They had it in the first place, but they did not retain that money because that money too went, not strictly speaking, back into Wilko, but into other shareholders. So the money that the remaining shareholders have is only the money that came out from after the demerger in 2014.
And they've spent it.
So there's 2 chunks to that. There's I don't believe, sir, that it has been spent. I believe it is either sitting invested in the trusts or it is sitting invested where you can see it in Amalgamated Holdings Wilko Limited.
Even any further?
Well, I wonder, those shareholders who departed, as you've explained, isn't there some obligation on them to contribute towards filling this very large hole at the moment in the pension fund?
So,
given that a large amount of their wealth was derived from the business, isn't there an obligation there on them?
I am conscious that I am not them and I cannot answer for them. I'm not their spokesperson. But that was a considerable time ago. They have not been shareholders of Wilko since 2014, so for 9 years. Since 2014, the business has traded successfully for quite a considerable period of time before we hit 2022 and the situation we find ourselves in today.
Okay,
Thank you very much. My questions are to both Lisa Wilkinson and Mark Jackson, and we've covered quite a bit of what I was going to ask, but let me just state this. 12,000 people made unemployed, many worked for decades, including some of my own constituents. You have anchor stores, very high reputation throughout many of the towns in this country. Rents 40% above market rate. You're a cash company and you had cash halved in 21-22, but actually you then talked about COVID, but actually you weren't doing so well in 2018 either. The GMB say in 2014 the writing was on the wall as you were moving away from being a cash retailer. In 2017 you set up Amalgamated Holdings. You talked about global supply chain, Mr. Jackson, being an issue, but if I think about walking around Home Bargains, B&M or The Range, I think of colour and lots of things on the shelves, whereas for quite some time now, if you were to go around Wilko's, you would see beige shelves, empty shelves. That's not something that's happened just in this last few years. So what could and should have been done differently in running Wilko? First of all, Ms Wilkinson, but then also, Mr Jackson, I do understand you were only there since Christmas 22. So if you had been there since, say, 2018, what would you have done in the meantime? So, Ms Wilkinson first, please.
So what should we have done?
Yes. What could you have done differently in running the company?
We should have had, exactly as you described, higher stock availability on shelf. We should, exactly as you described, taken greater steps to half of Wilko's sales were Wilko own brand products, so not branded products. So we should have taken steps to reinvent our category and product offer so it was different and better. And Kin, I believe it was referred to as Winnovate earlier, was part of our strategy to do that, to reinvent our product offer so it was different and better. We could and have been trying to rework our stores portfolio so that our stores were not over-entered, and so that they were in either the right towns, the right place in towns, on the right retail parks. Did I say already we should have gone larger on our digital offer? Did I? No. So we should have built wilko.com faster and better. We were, contrary to what has been suggested, still a value retailer. We have always been a value retailer, and value sat at the heart of the Wilko offer. But value has, well, in Wilko world, value has three components to it. One is price, one is experience, and one is quality. And there was never a desire to erode the experience or the quality of our product or offer for our customers. There was a great concentration on how you do that and still deliver product at great value to the customer. Could we have worked harder at that? I'm sure more energy and effort should have gone into it. I think those are my main. There is a whole load of others that I could raise, but if you're asking me to go back in time and what do I think was super important, I think those things were super important.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Jackson, do you agree? And if so, what could have been done?
Hindsight is always brilliant. I mean, I just want to go back to the sort of 18-19 that keeps being brought up as a year of when everything started to go wrong. It's my understanding, and I'll caveat this with I may be wrong, but it's my understanding that this was a disastrous year over a load of foreign exchange derivatives, nothing to do with underlying trading. And a significant restructure was required to recover the business from that, which was the process that it went through. And I go back to what I said earlier, the end of January 21, the business was in decent shape with over...
It was flying.
Yeah. So I'm dismissive of everyone's comments of what the strategy should have been in 18, 19, 17 when... Yeah.
So it wasn't COVID and it wasn't global supply because it was flying.
COVID, the decision, I'm talking about the decision to stay open, not furlough and pay rents, that was a big drain of cash. In the earlier COVID periods, that was fine. The 60 million of warehouse spent. What would I have done differently? It is, who knows? But the second I went in, I accepted that with the trading environment that existed, with the availability, cost out was the first action. 90 million of costs out on an annualised basis. Property was still over-rented and kicked off detailed planning on CVA.
Yes. Were you shocked when you arrived?
Well, I knew what I was coming into. So I came in knowing that the business was in, I'll call it distress, and that there was a window of opportunity to turn it around. And I still think it was a decent opportunity. A number of things went against us. I still think this business should exist, and I think somebody should have invested in it.
You just ran out of time, is that what you think?
Run out of the sufficient liquidity to get suppliers back on board, to get the stock on the shelves, would have given us a bigger window. And it's very investable. The management team, there's a new management team, went round to 20 sort of private equity type of investors as well as debt providers, and we got very close.
Right, thank you.
What was the point about the forex derivatives, please?
I think that's when there was a big loss in 2018-19, which was referred to, and I have to say it's conjecture, as the start of Wilko's problems. Was it bought all of its Far East product in US dollars. It took out forward rate contracts to fix the price it was buying at, and it made an enormous mistake. And as I believe, a loss in the region of £40 million on the FX derivatives.
In that year, yes. I can't give you the full detail on it, sir. I'm sorry. I could outside here, but I'd have to remind myself. But yes, that was the year of the FX issues.
Just one question. Mr Jackson, you've mentioned a couple of times just about the lack of action taken over furlough, and if the company had maybe decided to take that as an option, and Ms Wilkinson, you said that under no circumstances would you allow that to have happened, or stores to close during that period. But I just wondered if that was
It was not under no circumstances. We took a decision not to.
Not to, right? But did you? What kind of advice did you take at that time from your accountants and financial advisors to say, if you even did furlough on a looked at your least profitable stores, for example, or the most problematic stores, if furlough had been committed to at that point, what sort of information did you have that allowed you to come to that decision based on the finances?
Sorry, I'm interrupting. I'd need a CFO here to remind me of what the modelling was we did. We did a load of modelling around what would happen if we did or didn't. But in the end, a decision was taken by the boards to remain open. It was felt to be the right thing for customers. It was felt to be the right thing for team members. It was not a decision that was it was not a unanimous decision, so there were directors who had to disagree and commit rather than, so it was by no means an easy or ill thought through decision. There was a lot of discussion around it.
A figure that was bandied around at the time, how much?
I cannot. And we were largely in uncharted territory, remember, on the furloughing and COVID, but we did. A
lot of companies were in the same territory, and they made what might be seen as the right call.
We just finally bring in Mr Mills.
Ms Wilkinson, I just want to go back to the questions about your amalgamated holdings, Wilkinson Limited. I think the last balance sheet I could see, it had 16 million of net assets, of which 9 million were listed investments. And you said there were some stakeholders' interest that prevented you offering that up as sort of compensation for those who've lost in the administration. Well, which stakeholders? Why?
So my understanding is, as a director of AHWL, myself and my co-director have a duty to act bona fide in the best interests of that company. That is my understanding.
But usually you have to act in the interests of your creditors or your shareholders, which are you, and there really weren't many creditors of that company. I mean, were you never tempted when the crisis hit and you got 9 million of listed investments to realise them and tip them in the company and try and save it?
Oh, that debate we had, yes. Was there anything we could or should do to invest in Wilko? We didn't have sufficient funds to make a difference to Wilko.
Just out of interest, how much is sitting in the family trust? Is that tens of millions, or is...
No, it is a small number of properties, because we tried in... If you remember, in 2017 there was a whole load of adverse publicity about not being able to have visibility of private limited companies' shareholders' assets, and our response to that was to put in a vehicle that gave visibility. So insofar as we could, we got all of the assets from the trusts into the limited companies so that everybody could see it, and the ones that are difficult to get into the limited company so you can see them are property assets, because of course that incurs stamp duty, etc.
They're not worth tens of millions as well.
They're not worth tens of millions, no. But it's a small, I'm going to say 3, but I could be wrong. I'd have to check. But the intention was to put what limited, and they're not inconsiderable funds, but they're not considerable in the context of what we are talking about here, into a place where they could be seen so that we weren't accused of being opaque as a family.
Just finally, Mr Walton, you've not had much chance to say much, but have you reviewed Ms Venning's audit file, and are you happy that everything met EY standards and you'd have done nothing differently yourself?
We stand by the opinion that we signed, yes.
So Stephen, and then I'll ask James.
Yes, you may well have heard on the radio this morning, as I did, Doug Putman, isn't his name, talking about his efforts to buy the business, to which he says he thought he'd got very, very close to a deal, and at the end it failed, he says, because everyone just got a little bit greedy. What's your understanding of what went wrong there?
Mr. Putnam was one of 20, minimum of 20 conversations that were going on. He was 11th hour, so, and we heard from the insolvency expert earlier, he actually came in after the business had gone into admin. What he means by everybody being a little bit greedy, I am fairly sure, is the creditors that were owed money at the point of admin. If a new co was to buy the business out of administration, that those creditors, SAP, who kept your IT infrastructure going, would want paying what they were owed from the old company. So that's what he's referring to as greed, in my view.
Okay.
He wanted to pick up for not very much and not pay people who were the creditors who were owed money.
Was he the one who got closest to doing a deal?
I don't think he was. He was one of a number, but it became complicated because of needing funding pre-CVA and post-CVA. So we always had bilateral conversations going on with ABL lenders and equity investors, and there were 20, and different combinations of them would have had the same conversation.
Just very briefly then, Jane, just to wrap up.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr Walton, we have in your brief that you're the EY UK Head of Audit and most notably in the consumer products sector. So I would have thought great experience in one of the big four. We had in 2019, EY was called before our predecessor committee to explain its role in the failure of Thomas Cook. Since then, serious questions have been raised about the quality of your audits of London Capital and Finance and NMC Health. Why does this keep happening? Where is the public interest? And should the big four be broken up?
Few questions there. Let me try and take them in turn. So we take all of those, all of the outcomes of those previous failings or corporate collapses, I should say, very, very seriously. And the important thing is to try and learn from those mistakes. So if we look at the specific work around going concern, which is the most pertinent point here, since that time we've introduced new training and guidance for all of our people. We've invested in new external data sources to make sure that we can challenge management. And we've encouraged the use of specialists, as Victoria did in this situation, to make sure that the forecasts that are being produced by management are subject to sufficient scrutiny, plus the independent consultation requirements I talked about before. So all of those procedures have been introduced to improve the audit quality and the reliability of the opinions that we provide. In terms of public interest, since the firms voluntarily separated operationally, and that process started back in 2020, the issue of public interest is front and centre. So having a separate ring-fenced business, having independent governance that holds me to account, holds the rest of EY Audit to account, to remove any of the financial subsidies that may have existed between the non-audit side of the business and the audit side of the business, and to make sure there's adequate investment in audit quality. Public interest is very much front and centre of our culture.
So why does it keep happening?
Well, I would respectfully put into context the number of cases that you quoted versus the volume of activity that we undertake each year. We sign over 4,000 audit opinions each year. Some of those instances you talk about go back to 2018. So we've signed 20,000 audits in that time.
Understood. Okay, there are some big cheeses, including Wilko, anyway.
Okay, I'm keen to get on to the Minister, so let me wrap this session up. I think this has been a sorry story that we've heard today. We have had you, Ms Wilkinson, admit to a number of significant management mistakes around stock, around range, around furlough. We've heard about a £60 million warehouse modernisation that went wrong, a £40 million loss on financial derivatives, a process of restructuring rents that didn't go through. And despite those problems, you can't explain why dividends went up, We have money sloshing around in trusts that somehow can't be used to refund a pension scheme, and we've got accountants who are prepared to stand by the judgments that they made. We have at least had an apology, but I think we have got a number of questions to now put to ministers. Thank you very much indeed for your evidence today. Order, order. That concludes the session.